everybody, I am Melissa. This is Ginger, my dog, who is apparently saying hi. So, typically in this book and throughout the rest of our brief time together, each chapter is going to focus just on one specific religion. But here at the beginning, the first two chapters are sort of a hodgepodge of a bunch of different things. Sorry. And we have primal beliefs. That's our first chapter that has a bunch of different religions in it. And then we have ancient and classical beliefs. And these are grouped by time period, obviously. Between the two, we've got about 25 different religions. And nobody would want to spend however many hours it would take for me to summarize all 25 of those religions on a video. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some of the common themes of the religions in these various time periods. So we start, everything in the book goes chronologically by time period. So we're starting with the primal beliefs, which are the oldest religions that we know about. Humans existed for a very, very long period of time before even the earliest of these religions, and presumably had some sort of religious type beliefs and some sort of a system and rituals and all of those other things that have been lost because there was no written language and the communities died out and whatever else happened. And we're just not really sure. And even with some of the religions in this chapter, some of it is sort of guesswork from artifacts and from ruins of the city and from stories that have been passed down to members of these tribes that are still surviving today and the stories and things like that. So some of it is maybe a little bit of guesswork. And the term primal religions is kind of offensive, I think, and you probably wouldn't find that in a more academic textbook than this one. Typically, they're referred to as indigenous religions or something that's maybe a little bit less insulting, like the word primal seems to mean savage or something like that, and that's certainly not necessarily what's happening here. But one thing that a lot of primal religions had in common is the focus on nature. In particular, it was viewed as something sacred that was a gift to humanity that we could use to sustain ourselves, but that we owed just as much to the world as it did to us. And the resources around us were not just ours for the taking and the pillaging, but we needed to sustain the planet. We needed to take care of the planet in the way that the planet took care of us. And so there were a lot of rituals behind hunting and the preparation of meat and gratefulness for the animal to give its life for us to be able to survive. Same thing with trees and the building of huts and different structural things within the community and all sorts of things. There's a huge reverence for nature. And a lot of times, a lot of these religions, as you've seen, which hopefully you've done the reading assignment, is animism, which is a very common viewpoint in tribal communities in the earliest time periods of civilization that we really know about. The belief that everything has a soul. And animals have souls. Trees and plants have souls. Even rocks have souls. Things that we don't even consider alive have souls. And if you have that mentality, it's hard not to have an overwhelming respect for nature, because it basically says that humans are not really special in the way that maybe, Christianity and Catholicism in particular would think that, our soul is what makes us unique and gives us more rights than maybe other animals and inanimate objects and plants and things like that. So if everything has a soul, then I have to be respectful of everything. In the same way that I'm respectful of other people, I also have to extend that amount of respect to animals in the forest and all these other things that are around me, and understanding that without them, my life would not be able to exist. Ancestors were another big part of a lot of these primal religions. When people died, they didn't just rot in the ground forever, but they were still around somehow. There was some sort of spirit, there was some sort of light version of them maybe that was around that we could still have access to. People prayed to their ancestors. They asked them for guidance. They asked them for help. They asked them for all sorts of different things. They were still a very big part of the community, either being worshipped or prayed to or sought out or even just remembered through rituals and things like this. You did have, the earliest function of religion definitely seems to have been an attempt to explain the natural world. So clearly, people didn't have telescopes and microscopes and the scientific method and any sort of computing or calculating devices or anything like this. And yet people were still naturally curious about their surroundings, and people didn't understand why certain things happened the way that they did. And so this gave birth to polytheism, or the belief in multiple gods and or goddesses. And that these gods and goddesses were used to explain the things that people couldn't explain. So people didn't understand why women got pregnant, and so there was a goddess of fertility. People didn't understand why sometimes crops grew and sometimes they failed. People didn't understand what lightning was and why that happened, or how the earth stayed in place and what it had to do with the sun and the stars, and why the sun rose every day in the same place and set every day in the same place. People didn't understand this. So the sun was a god, right? And you assigned gods and goddesses to explain every natural phenomenon. Now, as science has progressed, we no longer usually appeal to religion to explain why any of these things happen. We can explain why the sun rises and sets without needing to say that the sun is a god and the moon is a goddess, and, have a whole long epic story about why we see them pass through the same part of the sky every day. And a lot of people use this as an argument for atheism, and to say, look, we needed religion because we didn't understand anything, and now that we can understand it and explain it through science, we don't need religion anymore. And I think that that's, true to the extent that the complete purpose and function of religion has changed, but that still has no bearing on whether or not it's useful in other ways. It certainly could fill a very different function now that maybe is just as important. And even if it doesn't, that has nothing to do with whether or not God exists, right? You're talking about religion is a man-made interpretation of the divine. Whether the divine exists or not is something that I'm not going to try to persuade you on one way or another, but it's certainly very different to talk about God's existence versus a man-made institution like religion. So religion has changed a lot, but in its initial stage, it was explaining the natural world. It was bringing the community together. It was giving people a purpose and a commonality. It was providing them with rules for living and behavior. It was giving them purpose, explanation, meaning, comfort about what happens when you die, right? All sorts of things. And a lot of these things are still true of religions today. And hopefully with some of the primal religions, and in particular some of the ancient and classical beliefs, you can see semblances of things that have withstood the test of time and that we do find in a lot of current religions, perhaps the religion that you would identify with, or at least that you might be familiar with. One other thing that I think is particularly interesting about religions from this time period is the way that they interpreted their gods and their goddesses. And this is more prevalent in ancient and classical beliefs than it is in primal beliefs. So primal beliefs were primarily when humans were living in very small tribal communities, and there weren't a whole lot of people, and they needed protection, and they needed guidance, and they needed wisdom, and they needed explanations and all of this. And then as we started living in societies, you have a different need now for religion, because it's no longer about bringing the community together and making sure that their basic needs are met and giving an explanation for everything, as much as it now is about making sure that people can live together on a mass scale, right? It's a lot harder to live in a city than it is to live in a village if the goal is to try to get everybody to live harmoniously and cooperatively and not murder one another. So a big theme in the ancient and classical beliefs is melding the political with the religious. And the ancient Babylonians are our first real concrete example of mixing politics with religion. And when you do that, you create a hierarchy. And you're telling people, you're basically doubling down, right? So you have to follow the rules, not only because you don't want to get arrested and go to jail or whatever the government's going to do to you, but also because you might actually anger God, right? Or the gods. And you don't want to do that either, because then you're not only screwing up your life now, but you're screwing up your afterlife as well. And this is also the start of when kings, emperors, pharaohs, right? All sorts of big leaders in that classical and ancient time period in the East and in the West this is when they started claiming that they were divine somehow, that either they literally could trace their lineage back to God, one of their gods, at least if it was polytheistic, or that God had appointed them specifically for this purpose, and that they were divine in that way, and that they had access to God and knew what God wanted of us, right? And as soon as you let the government start telling you what God wants you to do, in addition to what they want you to do, right, religion takes on a whole nother power. And if you look at religion historically, you can see people using religion as a political tool to either get people to conform, to support certain policies or invasions, to justify why certain people are superior and deserve more within that society, to make sure that people are conforming and not questioning what the leadership tells them to do, to unite, right? The Roman Empire used Catholicism to unite every land they conquered so that there was a commonality, right? Religion is a very powerful tool that has been used politically, and we see the very first usages of that here in the ancient and classical time period in particular. And so it becomes less about explaining the natural world and more about prescribing behavior for people. And a lot of people still look to religion for their morality and for guidance on what they should or shouldn't be doing. That has withstood the test, despite the fact that a lot of these religions are no longer practiced today. It definitely set the seeds for that aspect of religion out. And another interesting thing is, with the plethora of gods and goddesses, especially in the case of ancient Greek, ancient Roman gods and goddesses, they're very humanistic in a way that most religions now that believe in god or goddesses, they're not as humanistic. So a lot of the gods and goddesses in ancient and classical belief systems, they were flawed. They weren't totally powerful. They weren't totally good. They weren't all-knowing. They weren't always benevolent and looking out for our best interests, right? The gods were manipulative. They lied. They deceived one another and humanity. They came down and interacted and mated with humanity all the time. They made deals with humans. You could barter with them, right? You could say, hey, if you let me win this battle, then I promise I'll do X, Y, and Z for you, right? And the gods would take you up on it if it seemed like a good deal. And then they would betray you if they wanted to. A lot of early religions from both of these different chapters have trickster deities that purposely mess with humanity. And that's something that seems odd to a lot of people nowadays, especially if you have a Western conception of God as being all perfect and all knowing and all loving and all powerful and totally honest and all of those sorts of things. It seems weird to imagine a God that wouldn't be the kind of person that you would want to hang out with, maybe, if they were a person, right? Because they would be a liar and manipulator, and, right, Zeus was a total womanizer, right? I mean, he was not the kind of guy that you'd probably want to go have a beer with if he was a guy as opposed to a god. And yet people still worshipped and loved and feared their gods. So it was a very different sort of relationship. So a lot of the commonalities here are in the function of religion, in the purpose of religion, in the way that it played out in the everyday lives of people. And clearly there's a whole lot of overlap, and clearly there's a whole lot of really interesting, beautiful, unique things about each one of these religions. And I hope that you read the chapters, and I hope that you find them fascinating. And if you do find something interesting and you're like, oh, they only gave me a couple of paragraphs about it, I wish I knew more about it, I would like to know the answer to this question that comes up, do some research, right? I mean, now with the internet and with Google, there's really no excuse to look up and learn more about things that pique your interest. So I highly encourage you to find more information about any of these that you read and you're like, oh, it's not enough, I want to learn more about it. But hopefully you found this interesting. Starting next week, everything is going to get a little bit more specific, and we'll really get into nitty-gritty, specific, detailed beliefs and history of specific viewpoints. This was sort of an overview of where religion got its roots.